I held that tarnished tin box, the one my sister-in-law had just tossed into a contractor bag with the casual cruelty of someone discarding a used napkin, and I knew I was going to dismantle Faith Harvest Ministries brick by legal brick. That $400,000 house on Elm Street would be mine again, free and clear, and the pastor who weaponized my mother's confusion would watch his empire collapse from inside a federal penitentiary, while I lived in the home I'd paid for 3 times over. But first, I had to let the vultures who shared my last name believe I was a broken, pliable fool who had no idea she was being systematically erased from her own inheritance. For 30 years, I worked as the attendance secretary at Eastbrook High School, a job that smelled permanently of stale coffee, mimeograph fluid, and the faint metallic tang of the ancient radiator that hissed beneath my desk like a sleeping animal. The wall clock above my chair ticked with a limping second hand, each stutter a tiny metronome marking the decades I'd exchanged for a steady paycheck and a pension I might never enjoy. Every month on the 1st, I sat at my laminate countertop in my cramped one-bedroom apartment and wrote a check for $340. I tucked it into a floral greeting card, one of those drugstore, thinking of you cards with a watercolor rose on the front, and I mailed it to my mother's checking account at First Fidelity Bank. The ritual was as automatic as breathing. I would address the envelope at the kitchen table, the overhead fluorescent humming its tired tune, and I would walk it to the blue collection box on the corner of Maple and 4th before the last pickup at 5:15. Over 3 decades, the payments totaled just over $120,000. The house itself, a modest 3-bedroom craftsman on Elm Street with a sagging front porch, a chimney that needed tuck-pointing, and camellia bushes that bloomed lipstick-red every spring, had carried a remaining mortgage balance of $68,000 when my father died of a heart attack in 1993. The bank expected a check each month until the year 2023. I never missed a single payment, not when my transmission failed in 2001, and I had to choose between a rebuilt gearbox and a winter coat, not when I needed a root canal in 2009, and put it on a payment plan that took 18 months to clear, not when the high school furloughed me for 6 weeks during the budget crisis of 2015, and I sold my grandmother's engagement ring to a pawn shop for $400, a ring I still dream about sometimes, the emerald-catching dining room light in a way that made my mother say it looked like captured spring. I made it possible by living on rice and beans. Not metaphorically, not occasionally, but as the central organizing principle of my adult life. I bought 10-pound sacks of dried pinto beans from the restaurant supply store on Industrial Boulevard, a warehouse with concrete floors and pallet racks that smelled of cardboard and bulk cumin. I bought 20-pound bags of long-grain white rice that I portioned into mason jars lined up on a shelf like dusty soldiers, their glass bodies reflecting the weak light from the single window in my kitchen. On Sunday evenings, I would soak a cup of beans overnight in a chipped ceramic bowl, and on Monday morning I would simmer them with a bay leaf, a pinch of salt, and whatever vegetable scraps I had saved in a freezer bag. The rice cooked in a battered pot I had bought at a thrift store for $2 in 1994, its handle loose but still functional. I mended my own clothes with a sewing kit my mother had given me for my 16th birthday, a little wicker basket with 40 spools of thread in colors I never used, and a tomato-shaped pincushion that still wore its original emery strawberry, its green felt leaves faded to a pale sage. I learned to darn socks by watching a library video in 2005, the librarian setting me up at a small TV cart in the corner of the reference section, and I still have 3 pairs of wool socks with heels that are more darning than original fabric. I drove a 15-year-old Toyota Corolla with a dent on the rear quarter panel shaped like Nebraska, a souvenir from a hailstorm in 2011 that I never had the money to fix, and I learned to ignore the rattle in the muffler by turning up the AM radio to the oldies station. The car had 287,000 miles on it when the odometer finally gave out, and I kept a notebook in the glove compartment to track my mileage manually, each entry a small log of survival. My brother Dennis, who had parlayed a 2-year real estate license into a McMansion in a gated subdivision called the Preserve, a pontoon boat named Commission Check, and a leased Mercedes he swapped every 2 years like clockwork, called me a martyr at every family gathering. At Thanksgiving, as he carved a free-range turkey that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, he would look across the table and say, "Margaret Joan, always the saint. You know, some people enjoy suffering. It gives them an identity." His wife Karen, a paralegal with a botox budget larger than my annual grocery bill and a collection of designer handbags that could have paid off the mortgage twice over, would chime in with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. Some people just need to feel needed, I suppose. It's almost a pathology. The literature calls it codependency. I read an article. I let the words roll off me like water off a raincoat because I knew the truth they were too self-absorbed to see. My mother Irene had early-onset dementia, and there was nobody else to keep a roof over her head or to make sure she took her medication and ate something besides saltine crackers in the dark. I'd been her primary caregiver since the diagnosis in 2017, when a neurologist named Dr. Patricia Altman sat us both down in a small office with a brain scan illuminated on a light box, the image showing the ghostly white patches of atrophy that were slowly erasing my mother's ability to remember her own phone number. The disease had announced itself with small, forgettable things that I initially dismissed as normal aging. Misplaced keys in the refrigerator next to the milk. A checkbook balanced to a number that didn't exist. The columns filled with arithmetic that trailed into gibberish. A loaf of bread stored in the microwave. By 2019, she was wandering out the front door at 2 a.m. in her nightgown, convinced she had to pick me up from a piano lesson I'd quit 40 years earlier, and the neighbor across the street, Mrs. Kovalenko, would call me in a panic, her voice shaking as she guided my mother back inside with a gentle hand on her elbow. I'd clock out of the high school office at 3:15 exactly, my time card punched with a mechanical thunk that I can still feel in my thumb, and drive 14 minutes to her house, taking the back roads to avoid the traffic on Main Street. I'd spend the next 6 hours organizing her pillbox with its 7 translucent compartments, cooking soft meals like scrambled eggs and oatmeal, checking the locks on the doors 3 times at her insistence, because she was terrified of intruders she couldn't name, and gently answering the same 3 questions about where my father was, a man dead for over 2 decades whose name she still whispered like a prayer when she looked at the empty recliner in the living room. I would guide her back to her chair, wrap an afghan around her shoulders, the same green and gold crocheted blanket she had made during her pregnancy with me, and read the mail aloud to her, my voice steady even when her eyes drifted to a point somewhere beyond the window, and she called me by my late aunt's name. By the time I got back to my cramped 1-bedroom apartment on the south side of town, a place with thin walls and a neighbor who practiced the trumpet at 11 at night, I would have just enough energy to shower, eat a bowl of rice and beans standing over the sink, and collapse on top of the bedspread with my clothes still on, my calves aching from standing, my lower back a knot of fatigue. It was exhausting, but it was simple. I loved her, and she needed me, and the checks I mailed were the thread that held her world together. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early June of 2023, a day that had started with a thin drizzle that fogged the windows of my Corolla, I found her collapsed on the bathroom floor. The pink tiles were cold against my knees when I dropped beside her, the porcelain unchanging since my father had installed them in 1978, and the fluorescent light above the mirror buzzed with the same tired frequency it had hummed for decades. Her body was curled inward, her hand twisted into a claw, and her eyes were open, but seeing nothing I recognized. A massive hemorrhagic stroke had stolen her in the minutes it took me to drive over after my morning shift. The paramedics arrived within 12 minutes, their siren cutting through the neighborhood quiet, but the young man with the stethoscope simply pressed 2 fingers to her neck, looked at the other EMT, and shook his head once. My mother was gone before the ambulance had even backed out of the driveway. I stood in the doorway of the bathroom as they zipped the body bag, and I felt the grief hit me like a concrete slab dropped from a height, but I barely had time to register the weight before the vultures began circling. The funeral was held 3 days later at the same small Methodist church on Sycamore Street, where my parents had been married in 1962. I spent the night before ironing my one black dress, a polyester shift that still smelled faintly of mothballs from the back of my closet, the hem repaired with tiny, careful stitches that I'd done by hand under a gooseneck lamp, my needle weaving through the fabric like a small, determined fish. I paid for the casket spray, a modest arrangement of white lilies and baby's breath, with a credit card I knew would take me 6 months to clear, the interest ticking upward with every passing week, and I stood at the viewing with my hands clasped in front of me, my knuckles white. Dennis arrived in a rental Mercedes, his skin tanned from a recent golf trip to Arizona, wearing a crisp black suit of Italian wool that probably cost more than my car. Karen floated beside him in a cloud of cloying perfume, dabbing at eyes that stayed mysteriously dry behind a pair of oversized sunglasses that she refused to remove even inside the dim sanctuary. During the service, a man I had never seen before stood up to give the eulogy. He was tall, silver-haired, with the honeyed baritone of a late-night infomercial host, his suit shimmering with that slightly cheap gleam of prosperity gospel tailoring, the kind of fabric that looks expensive from a distance but pills under the arms when you get close. He introduced himself as Pastor Gerald Vance, founder and lead visionary of Faith Harvest Ministries, a non-denominational megachurch headquartered in a converted strip mall on the outskirts of town. He spoke for 15 minutes, his voice modulating between theatrical sorrow and oily triumph, about my mother's generosity of spirit and her eternal investment in God's kingdom, never once looking at me or acknowledging the daughter who had actually kept her alive. I sat in the front pew, numb and hollow, wondering how a woman who had lived on a fixed Social Security income and my monthly wire transfers, who clipped coupons from the Sunday Circular and reused tea bags until they were translucent ghosts of themselves, could possibly have been a major donor to anyone. I got my answer the following afternoon, and it arrived with the force of a freight train. The executor of my mother's will, a dusty local attorney named Mr. Hemmings, who smelled faintly of mothballs and burnt coffee, summoned us to his office, a cramped room above a pharmacy that hadn't been renovated since the Carter administration. The building had a single elevator with a folding metal gate that you had to pull closed manually, and the hallway carpet was worn down to the backing in a path that led directly to his door. The air inside was thick with the must of old paper and the faint whine of a failing fluorescent tube that flickered at irregular intervals, casting the room in a sickly green pulse. Dennis and Karen arrived with a leather-bound folder and an air of exaggerated sympathy that made my skin prickle. The reading of the will took all of 45 seconds, the paper in Mr. Hemmings's hands trembling slightly with a palsy he'd had for years. My mother, in a codicil dated just 18 months prior, had deeded her entire property, the house appraised at just over $400,000, to Faith Harvest Ministries through a quitclaim deed. The will itself, an older document from 2009 that Mr. Hemmings had drafted when my mother still recognized her own reflection, left everything to me absolutely and without condition. But the quitclaim superseded it because it was a recorded real property conveyance, and the law is coldly logical when it comes to title. The house was gone. The $40,000 I'd scraped together for my own retirement sat untouched in a modest IRA, earning compound interest at a rate so small it was almost an insult. But the asset I'd spent 3 decades protecting, the roof and the walls and the camellia bushes and every squeaky floorboard I'd walked at midnight after a call from a panicked neighbor, now belonged to a televangelist with a YouTube channel full of staged healings and a private jet he called Wings of Worship. Dennis slumped in his chair with a theatrical heaviness, his face a careful mask of shock that didn't quite reach his temples where the skin stayed smooth and uncreased. Karen placed a manicured hand over her heart, the 2-carat diamond on her ring catching the fluorescent light and scattering it against the water-stained ceiling tiles, and said, "Oh, Margaret, this is just so tragic." We had no idea Mother was that devoted. Something about the way she said devoted snagged in my mind like a hangnail. I had spent my entire adult life reading people, students who were being bullied but wouldn't say, teachers burning out in silence, lying parents trying to cover up truancy with forged doctor's notes. I could tell when a boy was hiding a black eye by the way he angled his body away from the light, when a mother was lying about a family vacation by the too bright tone she used on the phone. Karen's tone was too polished, the same false sympathy she used when a neighbor's dog died, and she was already mentally calculating the impact on property values. And Dennis, who had not visited our mother in the last 2 years of her life, who had once, over the phone, asked me if she was still seeing that specialist for the memory thing, because he couldn't recall the word neurologist, suddenly seemed far more interested in the modular wording of the quitclaim than in the fact that his sister was about to be homeless. He kept leaning forward, asking Mr. Hemmings about recording dates and notary requirements, his voice too quick and too technical for a man supposedly blindsided by grief, and I saw his left thumb tapping against his thigh in a rhythm I recognized from our childhood, the tell he'd always had when he was lying about who broke the basement window or where the missing $20 from my mother's purse had gone. I tucked that observation away like a receipt I'd need later, folding it into the back of my mind next to all the other small cruelties I had cataloged over the years. The morning after the reading, the real desecration began. Dennis announced that they were going to help me sort through Mother's things, which really meant they intended to strip the place of anything saleable before the church took possession. Karen pulled out a box of heavy-duty contractor-grade garbage bags, the kind rated for construction debris, and began sweeping through the living room with the careless efficiency of a crime scene cleaner. The first thing she threw away was the ceramic lamb I'd painted in 3rd grade, a lumpy, earnest thing with one ear bigger than the other that my mother had kept on the mantelpiece for 44 years. It hit the bottom of the bag with a small crack, and I felt the sound in my teeth. Next went the framed photo of my parents on their wedding day, my mother in a lace dress with a sweetheart neckline, my father in a suit he'd borrowed from his older brother, their faces so young and so full of hope that it made my chest ache. Karen tossed it without a glance, and the glass shattered when it landed on top of the lamb. She moved through the rooms like a locust, pulling books off shelves and dumping them into donation boxes, sweeping my mother's collection of souvenir spoons from every state park she'd visited, before the dementia shrank her world to 3 rooms into a trash bag along with a broken clock and a stack of utility bills from the Reagan administration. I stood in the doorway of my mother's bedroom, paralyzed with a grief I couldn't afford to feel yet, when I heard Karen's voice from the hallway closet, muffled by cardboard and mothballs. "Dennis, grab that tin box on the top shelf. It's just old bills, total rubbish. Toss it in the donation pile, or if it's too ugly, just bag it." The box in question was a small tin container, maybe 8 inches by 6, decorated with a faded Christmas cookie design from a brand that had stopped production in the late 1980s. I knew it instantly because I had given it to my mother as a Christmas gift when I was 12, spending 3 weeks of allowance at the 5 and dime to afford it. My mother had kept her sewing supplies in it when I was a child. Spools of thread in a rainbow of colors, a tomato-shaped pincushion identical to the one she'd later give me for my 16th birthday, a packet of needles with their sharp silver points, and a tiny pair of embroidery scissors shaped like a stork whose beak opened and closed when you squeezed the handles. Later, I knew, she'd repurposed it for important documents she didn't trust in a filing cabinet. I had seen her tuck folded papers into it during my weekly visits, though she'd always close the lid quickly and slide it back onto the shelf with a distracted smile. Now Karen, who wouldn't know a family heirloom from a takeout container, had already dropped it into an open trash bag along with a broken clock and a stack of utility bills from the Reagan administration, the paper yellowed and crumbling. I forced the instinct to scream down into my stomach and let my voice come out as a wobbling, pathetic murmur. "Just set it aside, please. That might be. I think it had her insurance papers. I should probably check for the death benefit information." Karen rolled her eyes so hard I could almost hear the muscles strain. "Oh, honey, the church will deal with all that. We need to declutter, not hoard. You don't want to turn into one of those people on the news, do you? The ones with the goat paths through their living rooms?" She cinched the bag shut with a twist tie and carried it out to the garage, where a growing pile of donations and trash was already blurring the line between the 2 categories, and I could hear her heels clicking on the concrete floor as she dropped the bag onto the pile with a hollow thud. I waited until they both left for a late lunch at a wine bar, Dennis's Mercedes purring out of the driveway with a spray of gravel that peppered the camellia bush and scattered across the sidewalk. Then I slipped into the garage, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and old cardboard, weaving between boxes of my mother's life, and found the bag with the broken clock on top. The plastic was cool and slick under my fingers, and I worked the twist tie open with a patience born of 1,000 small, careful tasks. I retrieved the tin box, the metal cool and slightly dented on one corner where it had been dropped, and carried it back inside with the care of a bomb disposal technician. I sat on the edge of my mother's stripped bed, the mattress bare because they'd already taken the quilt, a hand-stitched wedding ring pattern that my grandmother had made for her trousseau, and that Dennis had probably already listed on an online auction site. I opened the lid. The hinges resisted, then gave with a soft creak that sounded like a held breath being released. Inside, nestled on top of a small stack of documents, was a single sheet of yellow legal paper, the kind my mother had always bought in bulk from the office supply store during back-to-school sales. The handwriting was hers, but shakier than I had ever seen it, the letters slanting and overlapping, some words traced twice as if she had forgotten she'd already written them. I unfolded it and read, my thumb tracing the familiar loops of her cursive, the same cursive she had used to sign my report cards and write the labels on my school supplies. Margaret, my sweet girl, do not trust Pastor Vance. He is not a man of God. Save yourself from him and from Dennis. They have made a deal. I tried to stop it, but I was too afraid. I am so sorry. Please forgive me. Your mother, Irene. My heart slammed against my ribs with a force that made my vision swim. I sank onto the bare mattress, the paper rattling in my hands, and for a long moment I couldn't breathe. Underneath the note was a small spiral-bound notebook with a brown cover, its pages filled with more of my mother's jittery cursive. I flipped through it slowly, the paper fragile as moth wings, and the story unfolded entry by entry, a creeping horror written in the hand of a woman who knew she was losing her mind but couldn't stop the theft. The earliest entries, dated about 14 months before her death, were simple records of Pastor Vance's visits. March 3rd. Pastor V came by. He prayed over me and said my house could build a new sanctuary. He seemed so kind. I gave him a small donation. He said the Lord rewards cheerful givers. The handwriting was still relatively steady, the loops of her letters controlled and familiar. Then the tone shifted, and with it the quality of the penmanship. April 17th. He brought Dennis with him. Dennis said I would be a burden to Margaret if I didn't help the church. He said the house might be condemned and I would have nowhere to go. I felt so scared. He said Margaret works so hard and I'm making her life difficult. Am I? I don't want to be a burden. Another entry, dated a week later, showed the first signs of deterioration, the letters beginning to waver. May 2nd. Pastor V came alone. He told me that if I signed a paper, God would bless my family for generations. He said the house was a kingdom asset and I was just a steward. I don't understand. But he held my hand and prayed so beautifully. I was crying. He has such kind eyes. A later entry, colder and more specific, the pen pressing so hard it had nearly torn through the page. June 9th. I signed something today. I don't remember what it was. My head was so fuzzy. Pastor V said it was just a form for the church directory, but I think it was more. I keep dreaming of Margaret crying. I tried to call Mr. Hemmings, but I couldn't remember his number and the phone book is so confusing now. All the names blur together. The final entry, dated just 3 weeks before her death, was barely legible, the pen strokes jagged and pressing so hard they'd nearly torn the paper, the words climbing the margin as if she had run out of space. He made me sign something again. I don't remember what it was. Margaret wasn't here. I think I gave away the house. Why did I do that? I must call Mr. Hemmings. I must call someone. But my phone is broken and Dennis won't answer. I am so alone. Margaret, if you find this, please know I didn't mean to hurt you. Please stop them. They are making plans and I hear them talking when they think I'm asleep. They say your name and it sounds like a problem they have to solve. I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest, my breathing shallow and uneven. My mother had known. She had tried to warn me, but the disease had stolen her ability to act before it was too late, and the people who were supposed to protect her had weaponized every moment of her confusion for profit. Now the warning was here in my hands, the last lucid remnant of a mind that had been systematically dismantled by predators who smiled while they worked. I had to decide whether to crumble under the betrayal or to fight with every tool I had ever learned. I chose to fight. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that loyalty isn't measured by the blood in your veins, but by the steel in your spine when the world tries to break you. Now, back to the day I realized I would have to outmaneuver a con artist and the brother who sold me out. Dennis and Karen returned from their lunch with a bottle of Chardonnay and a revised narrative for my future. Over the next few days, they painted a picture of my impending life that was equal parts condescension and coercion, a slow, steady pressure designed to collapse any resistance before it could form. Dennis sat me down at the kitchen table, the same maple table where I had done my homework as a child, its surface now covered with legal documents and a ring from a coffee mug Karen had left untouched for hours, a pale watermark that would never come out. His voice dripped with false concern, the kind he used on skittish homebuyers who didn't realize the foundation was cracked. "Look, Mags, this is a disaster. I won't sugarcoat it, but we can manage it. The church has agreed to let us stay a few more weeks while we sort things out, but after that, the house belongs to the ministry." I talked to Pastor Vance personally. He's a very reasonable man. He said if you cooperate and don't contest the deed, the ministry might be able to help you find a small apartment, maybe even a senior living facility. You're 52 now, it's time someone took care of you for a change. You've been running yourself ragged for decades. He reached over and patted my hand, his palm slightly damp, and I felt the cool metal of his watch band against my knuckles. A few hours later, Karen slid a document across the island while I was nursing a cup of tea she'd made with an expensive organic blend that tasted like hay. "Just a formality, hon. A release of claim. Dennis says it'll speed up the probate process so we can all move on. The church needs it to finalize the transfer. Don't you worry. Pastor Vance has personally guaranteed you'll be taken care of. He even mentioned a small monthly stipend, like a thank you for your years of care, a little something to help you get on your feet." She pushed a heavy silver pen toward me, the kind with Dennis's Realty logo engraved on the side, a subtle reminder of the wealth I would never access. I picked it up, let my hand tremble visibly, and held it over the signature line. I let my eyes drift slightly out of focus, the way I'd seen my mother do when she was lost in a cognitive fog. I blinked several times slowly as if the words were swimming. Then I set it down with a small clatter. "I'm sorry, Karen, I'm just so foggy today. The lawyer from the funeral, Mr. Hemingway." "No, Hemmings. He said I shouldn't sign anything without reading it, and my eyes are so tired. Can I look at it tomorrow when I'm sharper?" They exchanged that familiar look of impatience and relief. Impatience because I was delaying their payoff, relief because I seemed too addled to be a threat. I cataloged it, filing it next to the other expressions I'd collected like specimens in the mental museum I was building. The next morning, Karen tried again, this time with a fresh latte in a cup that probably cost more than my entire set of dishes, its delicate porcelain painted with a pattern of tiny blue flowers. "Honey," I called Pastor Vance's office, "and they really need this back. If you just sign now, I can fax it over and we can all put this behind us. The church has even offered to pay for a nice weekend away for you, just to rest after the stress. There's a little inn near the shore with a spa and everything. Doesn't that sound lovely?" I nodded, a vague bob of my head, and said, "That does sound nice. I'll just need to talk to Mr. Hemmings first." I promised him I wouldn't sign anything without him seeing it, and he's out of town until next week. I don't want to get in trouble for breaking a promise. The mention of a lawyer, even one as dusty as Hemmings, was a barrier they hadn't prepared for, and I watched Karen's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Of course, sweetie. We'll wait. No rush. It's not like the church is going anywhere." But her fingers drummed against the granite countertop, a rapid staccato that betrayed her, and later I heard her hissing to Dennis in the hallway, her voice a blade wrapped in silk. "She's more stubborn than she looks. Hemmings is a liability. We need to get her out of this house and isolated. She can't keep running to that dusty old fossil every time we get close." 2 days later, they offered to move me into their home, temporarily, to help me grieve. The proposal was wrapped in the soft language of concern, but I saw it for what it was: isolation, control, and the removal of any independent legal advice. I agreed with a grateful, trembling smile that I practiced in the bathroom mirror, making sure it looked real enough to pass. I packed a single suitcase with my clothes, my toiletries, and every scrap of paper related to my mother's finances, including the tin box and the notebook hidden at the bottom of a duffel bag under my heavy winter coat, its bulk concealing the outline of the box. The drive to their gated subdivision called the Preserve took 40 minutes. Their home was an inflated version of a French country estate, all steep roof lines and perfectly trained ivy, a 3-car garage, and a kitchen island the size of my entire apartment. The foyer had a chandelier that probably cost more than my car, and the floors were a gleaming travertine that made my sensible shoes look like something a homeless person had fished from a donation bin. They put me in a guest room on the 2nd floor. a tastefully beige suite with a bed dressed in too many throw pillows, an en-suite bathroom with a rainfall showerhead that I couldn't figure out, and a single window overlooking the pool, its turquoise water shimmering under the afternoon sun. The room had no lock on the door, just a simple passage knob that could be pushed open from the outside without a sound. I recognized the tactic from a true crime documentary I'd watched while mending a hem 3 years earlier. Isolate, monitor, control the narrative. The first week, they brought me meals on a tray, sorted my laundry with a detergent that smelled like a chemical approximation of a meadow, and filled my day with mindless television shows that Karen insisted were soothing. The television was a massive flat screen mounted on the wall, and they kept it tuned to a channel that played nothing but home improvement programs and reality shows about wealthy women arguing over cocktails. They made a show of being helpful, checking on me every few hours with soft knocks and plates of cut fruit arranged in fan patterns, but every conversation looped back to the release of claim, to the administrative snag that needed my signature. Dennis would mention it casually, as if it were an afterthought. Karen would slide it into conversations about dinner plans or the weather, her tone light but her eyes watchful. I played my role, a woman unraveling. I wandered into rooms and forgot why I was there, standing in the middle of the kitchen with a vacant expression until someone guided me back to my chair. I asked the same question twice within an hour, my voice soft and uncertain. I complained of headaches and dizzy spells that forced them to leave me undisturbed for longer stretches while I rested. And I heard Karen tell Dennis on the second day, "She's worse than Irene was, honestly. This won't take long." In those stretches of solitude, I began my real work, listening at doors, memorizing the house's creaks, and cataloging every slip of information they let fall. The first red flag came from Dennis's landline. I had learned to move silently in socked feet, a skill honed from creeping past my mother's door during her lightest sleep, when the slightest floorboard groan would send her into a panic. One afternoon, as I shuffled past Dennis's closed home office, I heard his voice, strained and low, through the gap in the door. I pressed my ear to the wood, the grain cool against my skin, and caught the tail end of a sentence. "You haven't deposited it yet." No, we can't have a paper trail." "Cash," I said, 10% commission when the sale closes. "Just be patient." "The old bat signed it, it's legal, we just need to keep the sister sluggish until it records." "Yeah, she won't know what hit her. She's so foggy right now she can barely remember her own name." He hung up, and I retreated silently, my heart thudding so loudly I was certain he'd hear it through the wall. Cash, commission, sale. He was taking a kickback for delivering the house. 10% of $400,000 was $40,000, and it was meant to be invisible to the IRS and to me. I filed this away, writing it down in a tiny notebook I kept hidden inside the lining of my suitcase, a habit from my years as a secretary when memory alone was never enough. A few days later, Karen's phone rang on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower, the pipes humming through the walls like a distant motor. The screen flashed GV Ministry. Gerald Vance. I grabbed the phone, stepped into the walk-in pantry, and slid the pocket door shut, the canned goods around me smelling faintly of tomato paste and oregano. I answered with the bored, breathy drawl I had perfected from hearing Karen on 100 calls with her tennis circle. "Hello?" A smooth, slightly irritated male voice came through the speaker. "Karen, it's Gerald. Tell Dennis the title company hit a snag. The quitclaim had a notary issue. My wife Alina notarized it, but it turns out her commission expired 4 months before the date, so the document is technically voidable. We need to re-execute the deed. Can you swing by this Friday with Margaret? Have her sign a fresh one. We'll tell her it's just an updated tax form or a beneficiary change for the insurance. She's so out of it she'll never question it. And don't mention the old deed, obviously. If she finds out the first one was botched, she might get curious." I held my breath, my lungs burning with the effort of staying still. A notary issue, an expired commission. That was a fatal flaw, a crack that a competent lawyer could widen into an abyss. And they needed me, the addled sister, to sign a new deed to fix their own sloppy crime. I said in Karen's inflection, "Sure, I'll tell him. Friday works." I hung up, deleted the call from the log with trembling fingers, and slipped the phone back exactly where it had been, angled at the same 45-degree tilt. The notary issue was a gift, and I was already mentally pulling up the county recorder's website on the guest room's weak Wi-Fi to verify it, my heart racing with the first real hope I'd felt since the funeral. That evening, I hid in the guest bathroom for 2 hours under the guise of a migraine. The door locked with a rubber doorstop I'd smuggled from my apartment, the only security I could improvise. I spread the original quitclaim photocopy I'd made at the public library on a previous fake doctor's appointment across the cold marble vanity, smoothing out the creases with my palm. I'd already spent several late-night sessions navigating the clunky county recorder's database, a relic of early 2000s web design with drop-down menus that never loaded correctly, and a search function that required exact phrasing. I had cross-referenced notary licenses with the patience of a woman who had tracked down truancy through 6 different school districts, using nothing but paper records and a telephone. Eleanor Vance's commission number appeared in the database with a clear expiration date, 4 months before the quitclaim was signed. I printed the verification page on a portable thermal printer I had bought at an office supply store, a tiny thing that connected to my phone via Bluetooth and printed on slick thermal paper that curled at the edges. The document was now void on its face, a legal nullity that any first-year law student could demolish. But I needed more, proof of intentional fraud, not just a procedural error. I needed to show that they knew she lacked capacity, that they planned the exploitation, that they were not merely sloppy but predatory. A few mornings later, as I helped Karen unload groceries in a show of domestic cooperation, a stack of mail caught my eye on the built-in desk in the kitchen, where Karen did her paperwork while pretending to be a homemaker. The top envelope had been torn open carelessly, the paper ragged where a thumb had ripped through, and I glimpsed a credit card statement with a balance of $92,000 across multiple cards, many marked with red, past due stamps that looked like angry little flags. Beneath it was a home equity line of credit statement showing an outstanding amount that nearly equaled the appraised value of their McMansion. And a final notice, printed on a garish pink paper that meant business, from a marine financing company for the pontoon boat, the words "immediate action required" stamped across the top in block letters. Dennis's realty business, I'd overheard him complain on a phone call I'd lingered near, had been slow for 2 years, the market flat and the commissions drying up like puddles in July. Their entire lifestyle was a house of cards, and the $40,000 commission was a lifeline they were drowning without. I photographed the statements quickly, my phone camera making a soft click that I covered with a cough, and then I slid the mail back into the pile exactly as I'd found it. I used a household chore to establish my cover more deeply, to make myself seem harmless and useful in a way that they would overlook. One afternoon, the garbage disposal under the kitchen sink jammed with a terrible grinding noise that sounded like a metal spoon caught in a blender. Dennis stood there jabbing a broom handle into the drain while Karen fluttered with her phone, about to call an emergency plumber, her voice high and panicked because a $200 service call was now a line item they couldn't afford. I shuffled over in my slippers, my face deliberately slack, and said, "Oh, I used to fix the disposal at Mom's house. There's a little reset button underneath and a hex wrench socket. Do you have a hex key?" They stared at me as if I'd spoken ancient Aramaic. I opened the cabinet, found the red reset button perched on the bottom of the unit, pressed it until it clicked back into place, then located the hex socket in the center of the underside, a small metal opening that most people never notice. I rummaged in the junk drawer, found an Allen key among the tangle of rubber bands and dead batteries, inserted it into the socket, and worked the blades back and forth manually until the obstruction, a chicken bone Karen had shoved down there despite my having told her 3 times to scrape plates into the trash, loosened, and the motor spun to life with a healthy hum that vibrated through the sink basin. Karen blinked, her mascaraed lashes fluttering. "Margaret, I didn't know you knew how to do that." I gave a vague shrug, my shoulders barely lifting the fabric of my cardigan. "I don't know, I guess I picked things up. You just sort of tinker." The contrast was silent but sharp. The burdened sister could fix things with her hands, while the golden couple couldn't unclog a sink without a $200 service call. It reminded me that my working-class competence was a weapon they had no idea I was sharpening, honing it in the quiet hours while they slept. The critical phase of my evidence gathering came on a Sunday morning when they attended a 2-hour brunch with friends at the club, a weekly ritual they never missed. I had memorized the house's rhythms. the creaky floorboard outside the master's suite that groaned at the third step from the door, the predictable schedule of the landscaping crew, whose leaf blowers masked noise with a constant roar from 8 to 10 in the morning, the location of keys and documents, and the way the alarm system beeped when a door was opened. Dennis kept his sensitive financial files in a locked 2-drawer filing cabinet in his home office, a cheap steel unit with a wafer lock, the kind you could open with a quick rake if you knew what you were doing. And I did. When I was 18, I worked 2 summers in my uncle's locksmith shop on 4th Street, a dusty little storefront that smelled of machine oil and cigarette smoke, where I rekeyed pin tumbler cylinders, cut key blanks on a noisy machine that threw sparks, and occasionally fished locked-in keys from car doors with a Slim Jim while the customer stood on the curb looking embarrassed. The skill had lain dormant for 3 decades, but muscle memory is stubborn, and your fingers remember things your conscious mind has archived. I had fabricated a small tension wrench from a sturdy bobby pin, bending the flat end at a precise, right angle with a pair of needle-nose pliers I'd found in the garage, heating the metal briefly over the stove to set the bend. The half-diamond pick I'd ground from the handle of a butter knife, using a metal file I'd also snatched from the workbench, its tip shaped to a fine, polished point that caught the light like a tiny jewel. I knelt on the carpet in front of the filing cabinet, my knees pressing into the plush fibers, and inserted the tension wrench into the keyway, applying light clockwise pressure with my thumb. With the pick, I felt for the first wafer, a soft click as it lifted and set, the metal giving way under the gentle pressure. The second and third were similar, clicking into place with barely any resistance. The fourth gave me trouble, a binding wafer that demanded increased tension and a delicate upward lift, the kind of feel you can't teach but only learn through repetition. I closed my eyes, the feedback traveling through the metal like braille, the tiny vibrations communicating the lock's internal geography, and after 14 seconds the plug turned with a satisfying snick that I felt in my palm. Inside the drawer, hanging among manila folders labeled tax returns and auto insurance and vacation timeshares, was a separate red folder titled Irene Estate in Dennis's block handwriting. It contained copies of the quitclaim deed, a promissory note from Faith Harvest Ministries promising Dennis a consulting fee of $40,000 upon the successful transfer and sale of the property, and several typed memos between Dennis and Gerald Vance, printed on church letterhead and bearing the embossed logo of Faith Harvest Ministries. One memo, dated 2 months before my mother's death, stopped my breath cold. It was a single page, single-spaced, and the first sentence was a gut punch. Irene is declining fast. Her daughter still visits daily but seems too invested in caregiving to notice legal changes. We need to move on the quitclaim before she has her mother declared incapacitated. If we get the deed recorded first, the courts will honor it as the final valid conveyance. The only obstacle is the daughter's potential guardianship petition. I've stressed to Irene that Margaret would lose her job if she found out, so she's keeping quiet for now. That sentence alone established premeditation, knowledge of my mother's diagnosed cognitive decline, and an explicit plan to circumvent a guardianship that would have protected her. It was a roadmap of intent, a confession written in the cold language of logistics. I photographed every document with my cheap smartphone, making sure to capture the paper grain and the typed details clearly, the flash reflecting off the glossy paper of the promissory note. I replaced the files exactly as I'd found them, right down to the angle of the folder tab, closed the drawer, and relocked the cabinet using the tension wrench to rotate the plug back to its locked position, feeling the wafers reset with a series of small, satisfying clicks. On my way out, my eyes swept the room for anything else, and I noticed a shredder bin overflowing with cross-cut confetti. Most of it was unreadable, a snow of paper strips too small to reassemble. But a fragment caught my eye, my mother's signature on what looked like a check, the distinctive loop of her capital I, visible even in the tiny piece of paper. I pocketed it, sliding it into the lining of my cardigan where I had sewn a small hidden pocket. Later, I used a magnifying glass app I downloaded to my phone, zooming in until the fibers of the paper were visible, and I compared that genuine signature to the one on the quitclaim. My mother's authentic signature, even when shaky from illness, always had a distinctive loop on the capital I that dipped below the baseline and curled back up like a fishhook, and a trailing flourish at the end of Irene that curved like a smile, the pen lifting in a final, graceful arc. The deed signature was blockier, hesitant, as if traced slowly by someone copying an outline, the loops flattened and the flourishes missing entirely. The capital I was a simple vertical stroke with no curl, and the final E in Irene trailed off in a straight line, not the familiar smile. It was a forgery, and I now had the comparative evidence to prove it, a side-by-side visual that would be devastating in court. The following Tuesday, while Dennis and Karen were both out for separate appointments, I took the city bus back to Elm Street. The bus ride took 45 minutes, the seats covered in a scratchy fabric that smelled faintly of diesel, and I watched the familiar streets scroll past the window like a film reel of my life. I needed witnesses who could corroborate the timeline of manipulation, people who had seen things I hadn't been present to see. The neighborhood had changed little. The same cracked sidewalks, the same misses. Kovalenko next door, a retired nurse who had lived there for 40 years and whose kitchen window overlooked my mother's front porch. Her house was a mirror image of my mother's, the same craftsman bones, but her camellia bushes were white instead of red, and her porch had a swing that creaked in the wind. I knocked, and she answered in a faded house dress, her face breaking into surprise and then a deep maternal concern that made my throat tighten. Over tea that tasted faintly of licorice, served in cups so thin I could see the shadow of my fingers through the porcelain, I told her a careful version of the truth, leaving out the details of the filing cabinet and focusing on Pastor Vance's visits. Her eyes narrowed, and she set her cup down with a small clink. "I saw that pastor visiting many times when you were at work, dear. He always came with a leather briefcase and left with a smile that curled my stomach. Once, after he left, I heard your mother crying through the window, and I went over. I brought her a bowl of soup, that chicken and rice she always liked, and she was so confused. She said she'd signed something but couldn't remember what. I wrote it down in my date book so I wouldn't forget. I've been a nurse for 30 years, and I know when someone is being taken advantage of, and that man reeked of it." She disappeared into a back room and returned with a small, spiral-bound planner, its cover faded and the pages soft from handling. The entry for the exact date of the quitclaim, written in her neat, nursing school cursive, read, "Irene was crying, said Pastor made her sign a paper. She doesn't know what it was. Worried about Margaret. Told her to call lawyer. She said Dennis was there too, and he didn't help her. Mrs. Kovalenko agreed without hesitation to provide a sworn affidavit, and she squeezed my hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong. You always were the one who actually showed up for her, Margaret. I remember when you were 16 and you walked 3 miles in the snow to get her prescription when the pharmacy wouldn't deliver. Dennis was inside watching television the whole time. I also spoke with the mail carrier, Roberto, who was delivering to the street when I exited Mrs. Kovalenko's house. He was a compact man with a graying mustache and the kind of deep tan that comes from decades of walking the same route in all weather. I'd known him for years, had left him Christmas cards with $20 bills tucked inside because I knew the postal service didn't pay what it used to. He recognized me immediately and set down his bundle of mail on the porch railing. "Miss Margaret, I'm so sorry about your mother. She was a sweet lady. But I got to tell you, I saw things that didn't sit right with me. That brother of yours, his fancy Mercedes was parked in the driveway a lot last spring, and that silver-haired pastor was always there on the same days. One time I saw them talking in the garage, real animated, shaking hands like they were closing a deal. I remember thinking it looked like a business meeting, not a pastoral visit." He wrote a brief statement on the back of an envelope, his handwriting blocky and careful, and I later had it notarized at a shipping store for $5. These neighbor accounts layered community testimony onto the documentary evidence, showing that the manipulation had been visible to anyone who was paying attention, and that the only people who had looked away were the ones profiting from it. That night, back in the guest room at Dennis's house, after everyone was asleep, and the only sound was the distant hum of the pool filter, I examined my mother's diary more thoroughly under the covers with a small flashlight I'd bought at a gas station. The beam was weak and yellow, but it was enough to see by, and I turned the pages slowly. Near the back, pressed between 2 pages that were slightly warped from the pressure of the spiral binding, I discovered a business card. It was slightly warped, the edges softened, and the ink had smudged in one corner where a drop of liquid, maybe tea or tears, had fallen. It read, Evelyn Okonkwo, attorney at law, elder law, and financial exploitation. The address was an office park on the north side of town, and the card had a state bar number and an email address. On the back, in my mother's trembling cursive, was a single sentence. If I ever seem confused, call her. She will know what to do. My fingers tightened on the card, and I felt a wave of something that was part grief and part fierce, stubborn pride. My mother had, months before the final spiral, visited an elder law attorney. She had confided her fears, and she had hidden this card as a beacon, a dead man's switch that could only be pulled by the one person who would find the diary. Me. She had known she was losing herself, and she had planted the seeds of her own rescue, trusting that I would be the one to water them. I knew then that my mother hadn't been entirely helpless. She had left me a trail of crumbs, and I was the one who would need to follow it all the way to the end. I bought a prepaid burner phone with cash at a gas station the next morning, using a false name for the initial text message to avoid any traceable link. The phone was a cheap plastic clamshell, the kind that came with $10 of prepaid minutes and an instruction booklet in 4 languages. I contacted Evelyn Okonkwo's office from the parking lot, my voice low, and her receptionist set up a meeting at a coffee shop in a strip mall far from Dennis's neighborhood, a place with sticky vinyl booths and a hissing espresso machine that provided a blanket of white noise. I arrived early, claiming a booth in the corner with a clear sight line to the door, and I ordered a black tea that I barely touched. Evelyn arrived precisely on time, a poised woman in her 40s with intelligent brown eyes and a briefcase that looked like it had seen many courtrooms, its leather scuffed at the corners. I opened my plastic file folder, organized with labeled tabs I'd assembled over the previous nights, the kind of meticulous filing system I'd used for student records at the high school, and laid out the evidence on the Formica tabletop. The diary, with transcribed excerpts in my own handwriting. The notary verification printout, its thermal paper already beginning to fade. The signature comparison photos, arranged side by side on a single printed page. The promissory note, the capacity memo, the recording I'd made of the Vance phone call, which I transferred to a USB drive that I slid across the table. The affidavits from Mrs. Kovalenko and Roberto, notarized and sealed. And then I produced the silver bullet, a neurologist's report from my mother's medical binder, the one I'd kept updated with every doctor's visit, every medication change, every test result. The report was dated 18 months prior and signed by Dr. Patricia Altman. It stated unequivocally, "Patient Irene Dunham is unable to manage financial affairs independently and requires supervision for any legal decision-making. She demonstrates significant deficits in executive function and short-term memory. Full guardianship or conservatorship should be considered within the next 6 months." The date on the report was 3 weeks before the quitclaim was signed. 3 weeks. My mother had been clinically incapable of understanding what she was signing, and they had known it because Dennis had been copied on the report, his email address listed in the distribution. Evelyn listened without interruption, stirring her black tea slowly with a thin wooden stick. Her face remained composed, but I saw her eyes sharpen as she moved through each piece of evidence, her fingers tracing the lines of the capacity memo. When I finished, she set down the cup with a soft clink and said, "Margaret, you have built a stunning case. This is textbook elder exploitation, conspiracy to commit fraud and forgery. With that neurologist's report, the quitclaim is voidable due to lack of capacity, and the memo from your brother and Vance shows they knowingly and intentionally took advantage of a vulnerable adult. That's a felony in this state, with mandatory prison time. I can file an emergency petition in probate court today to stay any transfer and to void the deed, and I will simultaneously refer the case to the district attorney's elder abuse unit for criminal charges." She paused, then added, "But to build the strongest possible criminal case, I need you to continue living in that house and wearing a hidden audio recorder. Every time they pressure you to sign the new deed, every time they say something that reveals their knowledge and intent, we capture it. Can you do that? It will be dangerous, and it will be exhausting, and you will have to look them in the eye every day knowing what they did." I said yes without hesitation. Evelyn contacted the district attorney's office that afternoon, and within 48 hours, a detective named Sarah Ruiz, a quietly relentless woman with tired eyes and a voice that never rose above conversational, met me in the parking lot of a grocery store. She was wearing a plain blazer over jeans, and her badge was clipped to her belt where no one would see it unless she wanted them to. She fitted me with a digital recorder the size of a pack of gum, showed me how to activate it with a single press of a recessed button, and told me to record every interaction with Dennis, Karen, and any representative of the church. "If they so much as offer you a glass of water while mentioning the deed, I want it on tape," she said. "And Margaret, don't try to be a hero. If you feel unsafe, you call me and you get out. The evidence is secondary to your safety." I nodded, but I knew I wasn't going to call her unless I was bleeding. For the next 2 weeks, I lived a double life, the foggy, grieving sister on the surface and the meticulous operative underneath, capturing every incriminating conversation, every slip of the tongue, every moment when their masks slipped and the greed showed through. Then came the moment that burned away any residual family loyalty, the moment that I still dream about sometimes, waking up with my heart pounding and my jaw clenched. I decided to test the absolute depth of their cruelty. On a Friday morning, with the signing appointment at the church looming that afternoon, I staged a medical episode. I had researched how to safely induce a vasovagal syncope, spending an hour on the library's public computer reading medical websites. Rapid hyperventilation, followed by a forced bearing down motion that drops blood pressure and mimics a sudden faint. I waited until Dennis and Karen were both in the kitchen, huddled over the island reviewing documents with a pot of coffee steaming between them, and I entered the room through the hallway that led from the guest wing. I took a few sharp, shallow breaths, my vision beginning to swim at the edges, clutched the doorframe with one hand, and then let my body crumple onto the cold ceramic tile, my head lolling to one side. I kept my breathing shallow and my eyes slitted just enough to see, the world reduced to a narrow strip of floor and the legs of the kitchen island. What I expected even at this point was a moment of panic, a 911 call, maybe a hesitant check for a pulse. What I got was stunned silence, then Karen's voice, flat and thoroughly annoyed. "Oh, for heaven's sake, not now. Dennis, grab her purse. She might have the original will or some old paperwork in there. We need to make sure there's no copy of that old will floating around that contradicts the quitclaim. The last thing we need is Hemmings finding a copy and filing a caveat." Footsteps, sharp and quick on the tile. A hand, not feeling for a heartbeat or opening an airway, but tugging at the strap of the crossbody bag I always wore, the one with the broken zipper I'd meant to fix for 2 years. I lay there, my pulse a drumbeat in my ears, as my sister-in-law unzipped the bag and rifled through its contents while I pretended to lie dying at her feet. I could feel her fingers sorting through my things, my wallet, my keys, the small packet of tissues I always carried. "Nothing," Karen muttered, her voice dripping with disgust. "Just old receipts and a library card, and a granola bar that's probably older than this house. Help me get her onto the couch. We'll call the doctor after we deal with the deed, not before. I am not letting this derail everything now." Dennis grunted, and I felt 2 pairs of hands lift me roughly by the arms and ankles, not with care, but with the irritation of movers handling a piece of furniture that was in the way. They didn't support my head, didn't check for a pulse, didn't do a single thing that a human being with a functioning conscience would do when someone collapses in front of them. They dumped me on the sofa, my head bouncing against the armrest with a thud that sent a spike of pain down my neck, and I listened to their footsteps retreat toward the garage. Karen's voice, a final knife, drifted back through the doorway. "I told you years ago we should have put Irene in a home and sold the house then. This woman has always been a burden, and now she's a burden who might cost us everything." The cruelty of it crystallized into a cold, clarifying anger that I can still feel in my chest when I think about it. I had denied myself a full life so my mother could die in her own bed, and my brother was willing to step over my supposedly unconscious body to steal the last shred of what I'd protected. That afternoon, I called Evelyn from the locked guest bathroom, my voice a shaking whisper, and said, "I'm ready. Let's finish this." 2 days later, the trap was set. Pastor Vance, increasingly impatient with the delays and the pending probate stay that Evelyn had filed quietly without notifying anyone, insisted on a final meeting at the church's administrative office to resolve the title issue. Dennis and Karen informed me cheerily that we were going to a financial planning session, a wonderful chance to secure my future and put all this unpleasantness behind us. I nodded vaguely, let them pick out a clean blouse from my suitcase, a pale blue cotton that I'd had for years, and slipped the digital recorder into the pocket of my cardigan, its red light blinking beneath the fabric. I also carried a manila envelope with copies, not originals, of the key evidence: the neurologist's report, the notary verification, the capacity memo, and my mother's letter, the one she'd written with her shaking hand in the tin box. The Faith Harvest Ministries headquarters occupied a remodeled bank building on a commercial strip, its gold-tinted windows gleaming in the afternoon sun, and a neon cross flickering on the facade. The lobby smelled of new carpet and artificial floral air freshener, and a massive mural depicted diverse hands reaching toward a golden light, the faces in the background all smiling with a uniformity that felt manufactured. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset and a frozen smile, ushered us through a set of double doors and into a conference room with plush executive chairs, and a portrait of Pastor Vance grinning with folded hands, his teeth impossibly white. He was already seated at the head of a polished table, flanked by a nervous young man with a notary stamp and the church's in-house legal counsel, a man who looked like he'd been hired more for his ability to look the other way than for any actual legal acumen. Dennis and Karen took seats opposite, and I was guided into a chair between them like a fragile vase that might topple at any moment. Vance began with a smarmy prayer, bowing his head and invoking the blessings of stewardship and the generosity of the faithful. Then he slid a fresh quitclaim deed across the table, its paper crisp and embossed with the church's logo, next to a gold-lettered pen that had the church's name printed on the barrel. "Margaret, my dear sister in Christ, we simply need your signature on this document to clean up a small administrative oversight. It's the same deed your mother lovingly gifted to the ministry, just re-executed with a proper notary present. You're not giving away anything that isn't already dedicated to God's work. And, as a token of our gratitude, the board has authorized a small honorarium of $10,000 to help you relocate and start fresh. In fact, we have a check ready for you right now." He gestured, and the young man produced a church check for $10,000, the paper crisp and official, $10,000, for a house worth $400,000, while Dennis pocketed $40,000. The math was obscene. I looked at the pen, then at Vance's laminated smile, then at my brother's face, sweat beading on his temple despite the aggressive air conditioning. I picked up the pen and held it, letting the silence stretch until the only sound was the air handler pushing cold air through the vents. Then I set it down with a soft click that seemed to echo in the quiet room. "No." The word was quiet, but it landed like a gunshot. Vance's smile twitched at the left corner. Karen swiveled toward me, her eyes slits of venom, her carefully applied lipstick looking like a wound. "Margaret, don't be silly. You're confused again. You need to sign so we can all go home. This is for your own good." I straightened in my chair and looked directly at her, my voice clear and steady. "I am not confused. I know exactly what this is. You and Dennis conspired with this man to steal my mother's house while she was suffering from dementia. You forged her signature on the original deed, you used an expired notary commission, and you recorded a fraudulent conveyance. You assumed I would be too broken and too stupid to notice. But I have spent weeks gathering evidence." I opened the envelope and laid out the documents one by one, placing them on the polished table like a dealer laying down a winning hand. "This is the neurologist's report, dated 3 weeks before the quitclaim, proving my mother lacked capacity. This is the county record showing Alina Vance's notary commission was expired. This is the memo you wrote, Dennis, discussing your plan to move before I could have her declared incapacitated, and your admission that you used her fear of my losing my job to silence her. This is my mother's diary, documenting your threats and manipulation over a period of more than a year. And this," I placed the digital recorder on the table, its black plastic body unremarkable, "is the recorded phone call in which you, Pastor Vance, directed Karen to trick me into signing a new deed because the old one was defective. In our state, one-party consent is legal. I have recorded every conversation you've had with me and several you had without me." Dennis shot to his feet, face purpling, the veins in his neck standing out like cords. Karen shrieked, a high, ragged sound that made the notary jump. The pastor began to bluster about spiritual attacks and secular persecution. But before anyone could move further, the conference room door opened. Detective Sarah Ruiz stepped in, badge held high, flanked by 2 uniformed officers and an investigator from the state attorney's office. "Pastor Gerald Vance, you are under arrest for exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraud, and forgery. Dennis and Karen Dunham, you are being detained on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and elder exploitation. Please stand up slowly and place your hands where we can see them." Chaos erupted. Karen's shriek turned into a wail, a keening sound that filled the room. Dennis lunged toward the table as if to sweep the papers away, but an officer blocked him with a firm forearm and guided him back into his chair with a hand on his shoulder. Vance was handcuffed, still insisting he had been led astray by the enemy, and that the secular courts had no jurisdiction over the Lord's work, his voice rising and falling in the cadences of a sermon even as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The in-house lawyer sat frozen, his face the color of old milk, and the notary was already fumbling for his phone, probably to call his own attorney. Within minutes, all three of them, Dennis, Karen, and Vance, were escorted through the lobby past open-mouthed administrative staff, past that mural of diverse hands reaching toward the light, and into the back of separate patrol cars. I sat motionless in that conference chair, hands folded on the table, watching the empire I'd quietly dismantled crumble in real time. The criminal case moved with swift gravity. My testimony, backed by the evidence Binder Evelyn had prepared, was devastating. She had created a trial notebook with tabbed sections, color-coded exhibits, and a timeline that laid out the entire conspiracy from the first recorded visit to the final, failed signing. Dennis, facing multiple felony counts that carried a combined maximum of 20 years, turned state's evidence against Vance and confessed to identifying elderly members with assets and bringing Vance in to close the so-called spiritual giving arrangements. He admitted during a plea allocution that he had scouted the congregation directory for widows and widowers with paid-off homes and adult children who lived out of state, and he had fed Vance information about my mother's diagnosis so he could time the visits when she was most vulnerable. He was sentenced to 7 years for conspiracy and elder fraud, and he wept in the courtroom when the judge read the sentence, his shoulders shaking under his orange jumpsuit. Karen received 3 years of probation, lost her paralegal license permanently after the State Bar Association reviewed the case, and was ordered to sell the McMansion, the pontoon boat, and the Mercedes to pay restitution to the estate and the other victims who came forward. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex near the highway, and I heard from Mrs. Kovalenko that she works at a big-box retail store now, her designer handbags long since sold on consignment. Gerald Vance stood trial for 5 weeks, a media circus that drew national attention because of the private jet and the YouTube healings. The jury deliberated for barely 4 hours before convicting him on all counts: 12 counts of mail fraud, 8 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of elder exploitation, and conspiracy. The judge handed down a 12-year federal sentence, and during the sentencing hearing, he said to Vance, "You use the language of faith to pick the pockets of the vulnerable. You are not a shepherd. You are a wolf." Faith Harvest Ministries was dissolved by court order, its jet auctioned for $2.4 million, its assets liquidated to compensate the dozens of other victims who came forward during the investigation. A parade of elderly men and women with similar stories of confused signatures and friendly visits that ended in empty bank accounts. The house on Elm Street was returned to my mother's estate, the quitclaim declared void ab initio, a legal term meaning void from the beginning, as if it had never existed. The original 2009 will was reinstated, and the probate court formally acknowledged me as the sole beneficiary. I walked back through that front door on a cool October afternoon, the camellia bushes having survived the chaos and blooming with their usual determination, their red petals a splash of color against the gray sky. The silence inside was no longer a tomb but a canvas. I didn't want to live alone in a monument to sacrifice, a house that was just a museum of grief. So I turned the small front parlor, with its bay windows and fireplace, and the built-in bookshelves my father had installed, into a true countermeasure. I worked with a local nonprofit, Haven House, which operated a shelter for women fleeing domestic violence out of a cramped church basement on the south side. I funded a kitchenette with a small refrigerator and a 2-burner stove, a full bathroom with a shower that had a fold-down seat, and a private exterior entrance through the side porch. I granted them a 99-year lease for $1 a year on one condition, that they rename that space True Sanctuary. I had the name engraved on a small brass plaque that I mounted beside the door, and at the dedication ceremony, Mrs. Kovalenko stood beside me and cried. Within a month, mothers and children began arriving, their eyes holding the same tentative hope my mother must have felt in her lucid moments, the ones where she was still fighting back. I live in the rest of the house now, rent-free, the quiet ticking of my own clock the only soundtrack. I converted the attic into a small writing studio, carrying a desk up the narrow stairs in pieces and reassembling it under the dormer window that looks out over the backyard. Over the next year, I wrote a memoir titled The Unclaimed Daughter, detailing every step. The tin box, the diary, the lockpick, the neighbor's datebook, the dead man's legal switch my mother had left in the form of that attorney's business card. I printed 100 copies at a local bindery, a small shop that still used real cloth for the covers, and I shipped one box, no return address, to Gerald Vance's cell block at FCI Butner. Inside the front cover, I wrote, "For the man who taught me that the meek shall inherit the earth, but only if they do their paperwork, learn to pick a 4-pin wafer lock, and never underestimate a woman who has spent 30 years surviving on rice and beans. May you have ample time to reflect on the difference between a shepherd and a wolf. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evening, a cup of tea cooling on the rail, and I hear the quiet sounds of the women next door. A child's laugh, a soft closing door, the murmur of a mother reading a bedtime story through the wall. My mother once told me, when I was very young and she was tucking me into bed in the room that is now my study, that a sanctuary isn't a place you own. It's a place you offer, a space you hold open for someone who has nowhere else to go. I think, in the end, she found a way to offer one after all, through a daughter who refused to stop paying the mortgage on what mattered, who took a tin box from the trash and turned it into a reckoning. The camellias bloom every spring, lips decrepit and stubborn, and I prune them myself now, the shears heavy in my hands but the work absolutely satisfying. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments, and if you believe that the most powerful revenge is a properly notarized affidavit, a dead man's switch hidden in a cookie tin, and the patience to outlast every predator who mistakes your quietness for weakness, hit like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next story.